Hello everyone, this is your host Professor Reha here with the class examination of the Archon class, which is a combination of the Shaman and Oathkeeper masteries. Now, this one is a fairly interesting little build class because you can actually do a couple of different interesting things here, but the actual connection here isn't the lightning damage, but the physical damage that they mutually share. Now, there's roughly, I would normally say there's 3 ways you can really approach this class, but really it's more of a general focus with some splashing in of various other damage types depending upon what you're really going for. For example, if you want to run, say, a pet Archon, which is a little bit specific here, you've got some interesting options here, but the main way that I personally approach a pet-focused Archon is running, obviously, Primal Bond. You're increasing physical, internal trauma, and bleeding damage. Delightful. Now, what this basically does here with Primal Bond is you can pull most anything out of the Shaman mastery here, with the only exception really being Wind Devil and Storm Totem, which generally you should stay away from if you're running pets, but the rest of these can work depending on what you're really comfortable with. Obviously, if you're running Primal Bond, you're running the Briarthorn, and again, if you are running a pet-focused Archon, it's probably a good idea in this case to run melee, whether it be with a shield or with two-handed weapons. That's entirely up to you. But it is, of course, generally a good idea to stick close so you can get the benefit of Emboldening Presence. If you are running ranged, obviously you wouldn't run Emboldening Presence, but that's about the only real exception. But keep in mind that the Briarthorn, in fact, enhances the Guardians of Empyrean. Now, this might be a little confusing to you initially. Oh, wait, sure, but why would you necessarily want them? Because they decrease enemies' physical and bleeding resistance, which really benefits your Briarthorn and yourself. Now, keep in mind, however, that there is a mild problem that getting Celestial Presence with the Guardians of Empyrean is incredibly expensive, skill point-wise, so you have to be kind of careful with that. But it is extremely useful and can benefit you a lot. Now, if you are going to run these Celestial Presence Guardians of Empyrean, generally, I prefer using a shield, because then this means that I can bust out the shield, do the physical and the fire damage, right? You get this here. You get some extra fire damage going there. It's not strictly necessary, but it is something I do tend to run. You also get bonus physical, internal trauma, and fire damage from Safeguard as well. Sometimes I'll use Virus Might, which is physical and internal trauma, get some fire damage at this point, and some bleeding damage even, which is really nice. But what I really use this for, if I'm going to be running this specifically, by the way, you can also convert to full fire damage, but you wouldn't really normally want to, but it is something to keep in mind. But anyways, back to the main point. I'll run Virus Might, especially put full points into it if I intend on running a Shattered Realm Archon. If this is going to be something I want to be using to farm with, then I'm almost certainly using Virus Might, because I can bop from enemy group to enemy group very quickly and very effectively. And with the increased bleeding and physical damage and internal trauma damage and the decreased resistance to bleeding, physical, and fire, Virus Might hits extremely hard. And furthermore, in a strange twist, and this is going to sound weird, but you want to generate the additional threat from Virus Might. You absolutely want that. I was correct. I wasn't sure if the only part of this that increased your threat was the original. It is just the base. But you really want to attract enemy attention, which is why I'll usually run Aegis of Men here despite not having any internal trauma damage, because you actually want to keep your Briarthorn alive for buff reasons, because not only is he enhancing you, he's enhancing your Guardians of Empyrean as well. So in that particular regard, it's really nice to have the Aegis of Men here, have Virus Might, maybe even have Judgment if you really want to. Judgment's fantastic. It, again, fits in with the physical internal trauma damage. You splash in a bit of fire damage here, you're increasing it based on retaliation. Judgment is fantastic for exactly the same reasons, but what you really want is one of these 3 skills so you can draw enemy attention away from your Briarthorn. In the strange twist, you want to keep your Briarthorn alive because he's increasing your damage, and he's not going to be as tanky as you're going to be in a lot of situations. So one of these 3 is really important. Like I said, if I am going to run this in the Shattered Realm, I'm usually going to go for Virus Might. If I do not intend on running this in the Shattered Realm, I will usually go with Judgment. Maybe I'll do both. It really, again, depends on my equipment that I've got on at the time. But that is generally where I decide between Judgment or Virus Might. Both are incredibly useful. So do keep that in mind. That is something fairly major. Now, other really excellent abilities out of the Shaman, while any of these can in fact work really well with Primal Bond, some favorites of mine for some very specific reasons is first off Grasping Vines. You'll notice this is physical and bleeding, which means they will benefit from your Guardians of Empyrean. You can grab Entangling Vines for an increase to those. Some vitality damage, sure, but it's not that important. Also keep in mind that this does retaliation damage. All of these are really benefiting from retaliation damage. This does not. I forgot about that. But you can utilize Presence of Virtue and increase, therefore, your retaliation damage here, and you can run Ascension if you wanted to for an even bigger boost there. That's entirely up to you. Again, that depends on what skills you have. But generally speaking, when you're approaching this, you can run the Guardians of Empyrean. I like to, personally. You run your Briarthorn, and then you basically have... What I usually do is, let me demonstrate this very specifically with the full points, actually, so that you can really picture this in your mind. Now, I'm going to assume the melee, because I just really prefer it. But what you would essentially want as a response is something to deal with groups and something to deal with individuals. Alright? Now, a great way, if you really want to, is Grasping Vines really helps with both, and then you can absolutely run Ascension, so Clarity of Purpose, Presence of Virtue, Haven if you're running a shield, or if you don't want Clarity of Purpose because it doesn't necessarily help you a huge amount, you can run Rebuke, maybe splash your last 2 points in here, whatever, increase your retaliation damage here, go for some retaliation-specific equipment, you can do that. You can also potentially run Mogdragon's Pact. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of this in comparison with some of the other things available here. I really prefer Presence of Virtue for the energy specifically, but Mogdragon's Pact is really useful. Actually, I'm going to pull these points out because by now you've probably realized that most things here really work well with Primal Bond. Whether or not you want to go melee or range will depend on whether or not you use Emboldening Presence. Again, you don't need Guardians of Empyrean, but it is interesting that they can really enhance a whole lot of your damage output. But, you know, Grasping Vines is another great ability you can use there. If you are using two-handed weapons and you want something to deal with individual enemies, Savagery is great. You do the physical damage if you've got the right weapon. You've got bleeding damage here. You would get an increase in physical damage here. You, of course, have the increased offensive ability and health regen here. If you're using a two-handed weapon especially, you can boost that damage by quite a substantial amount, specifically... Oops, I can't remember how much. It's 18%, pardon me. And you can do a large amount of damage there, but if you're using a shield, maybe you want to go with Righteous Fervor, which is your physical, your fire damage. Here you've got increased attack speed, and you have internal trauma here. And, of course, more boosts from retaliation damage. You'll notice a lot of retaliation damage. This just generally works across the whole board. It's really fantastic. You don't need to necessarily splurge large amounts into retaliation damage, but it's pretty easy to, say, grab a ring, an amulet, a medal that you aren't necessarily equipping for resistance reasons. Grab one with great retaliation damage, slap that on, now you're boosting your damage by a bit. Not a huge amount, but it can sometimes really help, depending on how much you've got. But that's an option as well. You could also go for a full auto attack build with the shield, go into Smite, you can go into Shattering Smash, that's also an option. But you can really see where there's a ton going on here. You want to get some healing? Wendigo Totem with Blood Pact for the bleeding. Not the most effective option you've got because it's only enhancing the bleeding, but this is really nice to add a little bit of diversity to your damage types because physical is, of course, as I've stated numerous times, decently resisted across a lot of heroes and bosses at the ultimate difficulty. And, of course, elemental damage can sometimes be iffy. This is specifically fire, so it's a little less problematic overall. You could splash in some lightning, which Will help against fire resistant but not lightning resistant enemies. How many of those there are? Not too many, but that's beside the point. But the splash of vitality damage can sometimes be very helpful, especially in key moments against very specific heroes and bosses of the ethereal group specifically, who you would normally have a little bit of trouble with if you were focusing on the physical and the fire. But don't also forget that you have bleeding damage as well, which a lot of enemies are not that resistant to, so at least not if they're resistant to physical and fire. If they're resistant to physical and fire, they're probably not resistant to bleeding as well, so you can really get around that through bleeding a lot of the time. Not every time, but a lot of the time. So, it is something you can use. I don't usually use that. I'm, of course, really fond of Primal Strike. It really helps to keep your Briarthorn alive. Very fantastic. You can just torrent and then just Storm Surge, and it gets extremely messy very quickly, which is great. If you're, of course, using the two-handed. If you're using two-handed, again, you could also go into Brute Force, which is an excellent choice as well. But you don't necessarily have to be using Primal Bond for this either. As effective as Primal Bond Archons can be, and especially with the diversity of skills that they can pull from, I'm really fond of a nice Stormcaller's Pact. Running Savagery, right? Running good old Primal Strike, and then basically utilizing Presence of Virtue for its increase in its increase in energy regeneration, right? And then usually that's about all I'm pulling here. I don't have a shield. I don't normally pull that. Increase this nicely, right? Now, if I'm running Brute Force as well, which I usually am if I'm using two-handed weapons, I can run Resilience to increase those healing effects. At least a little bit, it can really help. And sometimes when I'm feeling spicy, I'll go for Ascension. Again, it depends on the abilities. But, you've got that option as well. You could also do a Spin to Win with Eye of Reckoning and Soulfire, but I've covered Spin to Win before, so I'm not really going to talk too much about Spin to Win in this one. I've got another video up with the focused builds that talk about Spin to Win. And I mentioned the Archon Spin to Win briefly there, but of course this is fairly standard. This is one of my favorite skill combinations in all of Grim Dawn within a single individual mastery. It's really fantastic. But what if, per se, you want to do something a little bit different? What if you want to run a shield? Well, that's absolutely great. First off, you can still technically run Savagery if you wanted to with the Divine Mandate. That actually works really well, because what you're really... It becomes this very interesting question, because Righteous Fervor does fire physical, increases your attack speed, yay, internal trauma. Whereas Savagery does lightning bleeding, physical, right? So you actually have a little bit more diversity with Savagery, because you've got the bleeding. So don't necessarily say, oh, I've got a shield, I should automatically go into Righteous Fervor for all of these benefits. Not necessarily. It really depends on how much of a problem you have, at least in Ultimate difficulty, which is where you'll really find out how much difficulty you have with enemies that are just resistant to the fire and the physical. Because if you're having a really hard time, it might be worth switching to Savagery and using that instead. Because even though it's a little bit better with a two-handed because Might of the Boar, you don't have to run it with Might of the Boar. This works really well with single-hand weapons. So if you are having a rough time, do give that a thought. So don't necessarily look at Stormcaller's Pact and say, oh, that's the only time I'll use Savagery. Remember that Savagery has bleeding and Righteous Fervor does not, and that can sometimes be more useful than the fire focus here and increasing it that way and all this other stuff. So just be aware of that. You could also do a two-handed build as well, just utilizing Brute Force and Savagery and Primal Strike. Really the difference here is that you just would be able to splash in a couple of other abilities. For example, you could, under this circumstance, which I prefer over Stormcaller's Pact, is if I'm running this, right, but I'm running Divine Mandate, I will absolutely utilize Judgment, because, essentially speaking, what you want to do is, and this is something I'll actually more specifically do if I'm working with other players, but with this alone, obviously you're going to have a pretty huge impact on the fight, right? You're doing huge amounts of almost chain stunning because of how long that stun could potentially last for. But that's not necessarily going to guarantee your allies' survival. What if, say, there's a bunch of ranged enemies. What if there's some kind of enemy hero running through the area or whatever? Consider this. Hold on, let me put all the points in here so you can really see the full picture here. Because this is most often how this is one of the most often ways that I play this. It's not necessarily the only way, but it is one of my more frequent methods for a couple of reasons. Now, what I am very fond of doing, I'll pull these points out of here because that really depends, is I won't necessarily put in all of these, but what I am fond of doing when I'm working with allies is I'll put 1 point into Virus Might just so I have access to the dash, and at least 1 point in Judgment. I personally prefer to max this out because it can be quite impressive, but it's not strictly necessary that you do so. So let's just assume for a second that we only put the 1 point. But with all of this, sure, you can chain stun a lot of enemies, but you're not necessarily going to lock down, say, a hero or a boss or a group of enemies focusing on one of your allies. Okay, zip over there with Virus Might, slap them with Judgment, and then from there, you can start chain stunning again. I'll usually employ Might of the Boar, but chain stun, if it's an individual enemy, use Savagery with Brute Force, absolutely fantastic. Then you turn around, and then you have to decide what you want to do with your last few points. Well, that really depends on what your ultimate goal is. Like I said, I usually will put them all into Judgment. Sometimes put them all into Virus Might, max this out at the very least, depending on, again, the individual context. Maybe I'll go with Volcanic Might. It depends on my equipment. I've also been known, of course, to put points into Presence of Virtue for that energy regen. I've been known to put in points for Resilience to help my healing there. It really depends on where you want to take it from here, but this will allow you to zip over and save your friend's life if they really need it. So, when I personally look at the choice between Divine Mandate and Stormcaller's Pact, for me, personally, it comes down to, am I playing this class solo, or am I playing this with friends? Because that alters that quite a bit. If I am playing with friends, I'm probably going to go into Divine Mandate, and I'm going to emphasize fire damage a little bit more. Now, whether or not I actually go into the full maximum Brute Force, Primal Strike, Savagery, really, again, depends on my equipment, but it's one of my favorite combos, and then I'll splash points into these two specifically just so I can go and save my ally's life. Alternatively, I will use Divine Mandate if I am looking to be using my shield, using Aegis of Men here to achieve a similar kind of effect. And then whether or not I use Savagery or not is a totally different question. I just prefer Primal Strike because it absolutely slaps, and it can chain stun a lot of enemies most of the time. So that's very helpful. But it's not the only way you can approach this. Like I said, you can go with Aegis of Men here. You can go into Safeguard, grab Savagery here. Maybe you grab Wind Devils because you like that elemental resistance. Maybe you're feeling particularly bold and you go Maelstrom. That's totally your mistake. I mean choice. But you do have that option. But that's basically how I personally decide between Stormcaller's Pact or Divine Mandate, is the question of, am I working with other people? Now, there is actually a fun little build that you can run as well under the Path of the Three. Now, I'm usually going to use this with a shield, and that's specifically because I can bust out Aegis of Men here. Aegis of Thorns. You're converting that fire damage to acid damage, which is being boosted by Path of the Three. It's absolutely delicious, and I'll usually run Righteous Fervor under Dreeg's Reproach, again to get that vitality damage going, because what you really want is Wendigo Totem. Also, by the way, that last one where I talked about Divine Mandate, I forgot to pull 20. I could have pulled out 20-ish points here, 18 points, which could have been put more into Volcanic Stride or Crushing Verdict or whatever else you want. So you actually have more points with that than I was actually talking about, because you can actually go all the way back to even just the 32 if you were going to run full Savagery. And you can run Virus Might and or Judgment or whatever else you want. So do keep that in mind that I have not been pulling back the points in this particular instance. So the last build, where I was talking about saving your friends, you have a little bit more leeway than that. Back to the very interesting, not often talked about, Poisonous Archon. Going with Dreeg's Reproach here, Poison Vitality, it's absolutely delicious. And then you go Wendigo Totem, pull this back a little bit. And then maybe you want to go into Devouring Swarm. Now, again, I'm not a huge fan of Devouring Swarm. If I'm working with allies and they happen to be doing vitality and or bleeding damage, then I'll build this, but otherwise I need equipment that boosts this to use this specifically. I'm just really not a fan. But I will often go into Grasping Vines. This is very, very nice indeed. Or maybe I'll still go into Primal Strike. That's also an option. Maybe I won't necessarily go into Aegis of Men here. I have to have a very specific build in mind to do that, though, so it's not very often that I do. But it is something you can do. Again, don't feel obligated necessarily to go into a shield. You can go two-handed weapon, go into Primal Strike, take advantage of that bleeding damage. Right? If you are using Devouring Swarm, that can be really quite effective. But if you are running Path of the Three, I usually run Shield, Aegis of Men here, Aegis of Thorns, run a delicious Blood-Packed Wendigo Totem. Maybe I'll even go really hardcore and go with a Corrupted Storm Totem. Sometimes I do that if I have points to spare. I can swing that. Sometimes I'll do that. It really depends on if you really want 12 totems flying around. Some people do. Some people really like that. Totally up to you. But these are generally a lot of the broad ways of approaching this particular class. I'll probably come back to this class a second time actually later on. There's a lot you can do here, but when I come back to this through item sets and stuff, I will talk a lot more about some very specific things. But as you can see, there's a lot of different skills here that cross over one way or another with other damage types. But a lot of people say, I mean, it's less common now, but way back in the day it was like, oh, the elemental damage is what connects them. Yay. Not really. It's the physical internal trauma damage that tends to overlap in a lot of these builds, you may have noticed. So you really have a lot of leeway to mix and match skills and abilities here. This is another one of those rare classes where it's extremely difficult to mess this up. So if you just want to freely experiment, or if you want to improv, or you're really uncertain of where you want to take it and you're not really sure, this is great. The Archon is absolutely fantastic for this, because you can pretty much put points into whatever, and with some mild adjustment, if you don't like it, you can make it work. So, we'll be talking way more in depth about the Archon later on. Don't worry about that. For this one, I haven't gotten really into specifics, because the specifics of this really do require items. It's great without items. You don't need items to make this really awesome. It's just that a lot of the more specific builds do get down to what items you have. I've been mentioning that pretty consistently throughout this particular episode, and it's absolutely true. What specifically you equip in this combination really does depend on your equipment, but you can make anything work until you've got your equipment sorted out. Most anything works here. So with that being said, thank you all very much for joining me. If you liked this, please like and subscribe. If you did not, please ignore me. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, what have you, please leave them down in the comment section below. I'd love to read them. And thank you all very much for joining me. Have a great 24 hours.